Derren Brown, thanks for coming on Under the Skin. I've wanted to talk to you in this format for a long while.
Oh, this is such a treat. Thank you very, very much for asking me.
It's lovely to have you. The thing I'm most interested in when I think of umbrellaing a conversation with you is, have any of your experiences from your skeptical perspective led you to query your own certainty? Because you've famously made a journey from quite an orthodox and religious upbringing to being an outspoken atheist. But now that you've worked continually in the area of I would say sort of, manipulation of consciousness and the various hypnotic techniques and the wonderful shows that you've done, what things have you encountered that have made you question your certainty?
Well, that's a big one to start off with.
How was the journey?
The journey was also nice.
Nice weather today.
Last time I saw you, just before I answer that question,
You're the hypnotist. You'll decide how this goes.
I will decide exactly how this goes. No, you came round to my house, and
I loved it there.
Thank you, and I loved having you there. And my partner at the time was there, and his mother, who was at the time terminally ill, no longer with us, sadly. But you came in and she was sat down and clearly unwell, and you were so amazing. I think she must have said, "Look, I'm not well," and you pretty much knelt down next to her, and you were so focused and so present with her. And I don't know what you said, because you were having a private conversation with her, but it was sort of the opposite of what any of us would do, which is probably naturally feel a little awkward or self-conscious in that situation. And it was amazing. Always stay with me. You're a very lovely man. So thank you for that. I never got to say to you, that was amazing.
Years ago, you could have sent me a text.
I could have. Well, I've texted you many times. You haven't replied. So.
Unless there's direct praise for a messianic moment of interaction.
I give with one hand.
I see how you operate. Sorry. No, I'm glad you told me that story, because the fact that I don't remember stuff like that directly, I do recall the occasion now, it suggests to me that I'm not as narcissistic as I imagine myself to be. Yeah. Otherwise, I'd be able to recall those kind of moments.
Exactly what you said.
But I do remember that configuration of people and that event. When you say that to me, it makes me feel like I often feel more comfortable when people talk to me on the level of, this is who I am. Yeah. I struggle more when you're on the the gentle negotiation of, we're apes and we could fucking kill each other at any moment. So let's just gently talk about the weather and see if we can keep this in manageable parameters.
It's so true, because I always think of myself as one of those people that's hopeless at parties, and I think, I'm just shy and so on. But actually, I think probably most people like me like that. It's not that you don't want to talk to people. You do want to talk to people. You want to have a proper conversation. And what gets in the way of that, and all the millions of reasons why that's sort of not always appropriate. I was at a party the other day, and I met a guy called Liam Allen, who's been in the paper recently because he had a lot of false rape accusations made against him, and he's only 23 or something, and he started a campaign against that sort of thing, about that, because the police dealt really badly with the case, and it was an amazing conversation to have at a party. And not
because it went in deep.
Well, it just don't
do that joke.
It was just it's just what you want. It's a proper. I mean, it was obviously horrendous, unfortunate sort of conversation, but it was a really interesting conversation. See this guy taking something horrible and turned it into something sort of great and important. So it's proper conversations.
But whether or not you're
I still haven't answered your question. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Let's let it be on the back burner. The question being, has any of Derren's investigations into the world of sort of woo-woo mysticism led to moments of curiosity about the unknown and the unknowable? We'll leave that hovering, lurking as a spectre in the space, while continuing to examine the idea of whether it is a person who, in that instance, in the case of your ex's mum, sort of spoke about from a position of fear about her mortality and her sadness, or a person who's going through crisis, the dreadful crisis of false accusation. In that moment, I think I recently had a conversation with a woman on the phone. I'd never met her. Her brother asked me to talk to her, and she'd lost her son through sort of a party drug type terrible misdemeanor. And when she was telling me this, I thought, in the moment, it went through my head, I'm not qualified to deal with this, so I have to find in myself the human capacities of compassion and warmth, whilst knowing really, like, there's certain things in life that there is no combination of words that are going to sort of push someone into a new state of mind. But often what's being asked of you, I understand, is a kind of presence, a kind of witness, being there for someone. Now, like, I've almost had the opposite journey to you of coming from a position of, if not atheism, nihilism, and like kind of massive, like sort of individualism, to a position of like, I believe in God, and we can have a long conversation, and hopefully we will, about like sort of like the sort of the degree of orthodoxy and where I draw that idea from and how I sort of personally interact with it. But in an instance like that, that's almost kind of what I'm interfacing with. I'm like, my individual personal consciousness can't deal with this. Please give me access to what I need to be and need to say so that I can hold this woman in this moment and say the right thing. And for me, it's a kind of a yielding and a kind of surrender and letting go of the limitations of my own sort of ego, so that I can be present, so that I don't say something mad. And there's enough examples in my own life of actually saying something mad, but less and less lately, the more and more I've been sort of surrendering.
But that important is just being present, isn't it? I do have this sort of thing, like if we go back to, say, the party situation or most social situations, that you see the version of somebody that they show you. You see this lovely, polished, probably the best version of themselves they're showing you. In the same way, if you have a couple over for dinner, you tend to see that relationship working at its best. But then you know that you yourself have this, not you, well, all of us, we have this, big, ugly, clumsy, embarrassing thing called a private life that follows us around like a big lumbering giant. And it's our starting point is we forget they've got exactly the same thing. We're seeing this lovely polished version of themselves. We're comparing it to what we know of ourselves, which is very different. And that's a difficult starting point. And I think ultimately, and of course things like, Instagram make it so much worse, because then you're dealing with highly polished, branded versions of people, that comparing that with your sort of worthless private life and all the clumsiness and embarrassment that comes with that. But ultimately, I think we just desperately want to know that the things that are wrong with us are shared by other people, and for someone just to be present with us, because it just sort of validates everything, doesn't it? It's such a basic thing. I don't know how, if you are growing up in that generation now where you're only seeing these horribly polished, curated versions of other people's lives, how you find any place to put your own complicated, messy internal experience in relation to that.
In a sense, it can only come from one another, and from our dealing with ourselves in conjunction with and collaboration with one another. Like on my own, my tendency is to become quite self-condemning, isolated and fearful, almost as if, well, not almost as if, we're not designed to live solipsistic lives trapped in sort of neurological circuits of self-doubt and continual examination. We have to break that up with interaction. We do need to have external connection. Again, trying to move to my initial question that you're dancing around like Nureyev, when I think of, we live in post-logical positivism, which is a phrase I learned about an hour ago, and I'm very keen to use in the podcast.
Have a grape.
Have I earned a grape yet, Darren? Is this something that you're going to use to manipulate me over the course of the interview? A grape reward?
There is a bowl of grapes on the table if you can't see it. Are we being filmed? I didn't even know if you do film.
Yeah, that's right. There'll be some
they can
clips.
see the grapes on the table
if they want. They can listen to it as audio, but vivid linguists such as we can paint a portrait of these grapes as effortlessly as Rembrandt, I would say. Portrait might not be the right time, but my point being that we sort of have a tendency, and in a sense, from a cultural perspective, you've touched upon it through mentioning Instagram, to live in a sort of a sensory and empirical realm of like, these are the patterns that we can observe optically, these are the patterns I can smell and taste and hear, but we know that there are patterns beyond the limitations of the sensory realm through the magnification achieved through the practice of science. But my understanding is that there are some patterns and forms of consciousness that may not exist within the remit of ordinary sensory experience. Now, when you get a version of that, as you evidently did in a Christian upbringing, that didn't chime with you and felt like presumably reductive and I'm guessing at odds with who you were as an individual, most obviously sexuality, I'm guessing, that may set you in a position of adversity to many of the ideas that are smuggled along with mysticism. But I'm interested in how, because it seems to me that you're moving from a position of entertainer to a position of sort of personal development and self-awareness and healing in one sense. So I want to talk about what your relationship is to the mystical and as you continue to evolve.
Okay.
That was a long question, wasn't it, mate?
Yeah.
Have a grape.
We'll
stop for a brief grape.
We'll stop for a brief grape. They're good grapes.
Grape.
Excellent grapes. Sound of water and grapes.
Very professional. You should definitely have your own podcast.
Thank you. I'm thinking about it. There's something else to talk about, but we should probably answer the question. I was very much a Christian. The sexuality thing didn't put me at odds against it. I think actually what happened was that Christian became quite a sort of nice way of covering up the sort of awkwardness of the whole sexy world, because I didn't quite know where that was going. So it was quite nice having a sort of a general excuse as to why I didn't really talk about those things, because I was too pious. But then I became, I definitely became like an atheist, and but that was really because I didn't have a lot of Christian friends, so it was very much a private belief. And I just sort of thought bit by bit I couldn't really justify it. I had a friend who was a psychic healer, and we had lots of heated discussions whereby I was saying, look, this is just a nonsense circular belief, and you're just, looking for confirmation for what you already believe and so on, and there's no evidence to support it. And I was sort of thinking in the back of my mind, well, I'm sure it's exactly the same with a religious belief. So I ended up not really being able to justify it, and so turned very much against it. And I think when you do that, you have a very strong disbelief that matches your initially strong belief, right? That would make sense. I've softened since then. I don't believe in God, I wouldn't say, but what I do think, this is particularly, like, I'm 48, right? So I'm sort of now in that kind of...
You're looking good.
So thank you very much. A lot of moisturiser. So quite expensive moisturiser. And as I've sort of started the sort of second half of life, you become aware of the importance of... So I guess in Jungian terms, you've slain the dragon, and now you've got to rescue the princess, right? So your ego's been out there battling around, being ambitious, and all those things that it kind of has to do to find out who it is. But now you need to serve something bigger. The ego needs to step down. So there's death and resurrection right there.
Yes.
Something has to die in order for something new to grow.
Yes.
So the way I now see religions, that I think it points to something that is really important as part of a human experience, and that is transcending, essentially, connecting with something larger than yourself. I think historically something happened that gave people a real kind of visceral knowledge of that feeling, whatever that meant back then, and then as time moves on, that moment in history falls out of living memory, so beliefs and practices arise to recreate that sort of feeling, but they're now already divorced from whatever that was. And then time moves on, and that becomes the church, and the church becomes politicized and monetized and so on. And now what you end up with is a set of it creates dogma for a start. All of these are very different things from the original experience. It creates a lot of things that are now very easy to take a pop at as an atheist. And there's no reason not to, I suppose. But they are signposts, I think, back to something that is important, and that's a feeling of connecting with something that's bigger than yourself. So, and if you don't find a place for that, it tends to latch itself onto things that don't satisfy it, like money and like fame and so on, that we think will give us an elevation out of our ordinary life and a transformation and all of those things. And of course they don't. So we need to find it somewhere. It doesn't need to be with God, doesn't need to be anything that's overtly spiritual. We might find it through our kids or through, the work that we do, or kind of anything really. But it's important to find it somewhere, because otherwise you're left without any real kind of meaning, and meaning trumps happiness, I think, any day.
Yes.
That was my answer. Can I have a grape?
Yeah, you can. I think after that, you have got limitless access to grapes. So then, I'll follow you home if you want, with a little satchel of grapes, lowering them. What I reckon is, like from what you've said there, because obviously all of us, like, sort of, we're wedded to our own sort of subjective encounters with institutionalized ideas, and because my childhood was, I think, almost, it felt to me organically about the rejection of, like, I don't like this school, I'm not sure I even like family, I don't like it, like a sort of cynical rejection. I guess I was probably wounded and afraid and didn't trust anything or anyone. So, like, my personal evolution has been about allowing some of those ideas and being sort of softening my resistance to them. And then, of course, significantly, I had sort of psychedelic encounters in, like, sort of adolescence, of taking hallucinogens and experiencing this dissolution of self, and again, not in the type of way that people should be taking hallucinogens, in my opinion, like with some sort of, either some kind of shaman or a gentleman in a white coat with his arm around just saying, it's okay, have another sip of water, like with lads from Leeds in New Cross, like a miserable, oh my God, there is no me, how is my consciousness operating my hand, where do these things intersect, the material and the immaterial world? So, and because I'm in sort of a 12-step recovery program, which requires the kind of Jungian journey that you've alluded to, the willingness to let go of the egoic dragon greed self and the accepting of a quest. I've been thinking a lot that, for me personally, I have to let go of the idea of happiness and embrace the idea of purpose. Happiness so fleeting and so intrinsically related to pleasure in the kind of culture that we're from, that purpose is a much more noble or possibly even helpful guide. But like, when you've done so many brilliant things, apparently magical things, like sort of the ones that sort of stay with me, like the one where, like, it seemed like that guy was getting those letters to win those races, but everyone had every possible permutation. I fucking love that one. I tell people about that in America if a few people that are not are familiar with your work. And then and the one where you got the advertising execs through suggestion to sort of use a particular advertising motif for a pet cemetery, I think it was. And I've been to your live shows as well and seen you whittle through audiences, which you've sort of explained to me subsequently as like a way of ascertaining the sort of suggestibility or malleability or just the ease of working with them. I've seen and that mad shit you did with bus routes and timetables. I've seen you achieve so many incredible things, which you've explained to me as simply the result of endeavour and practice, not the result of
cheating sometimes.
Downright cheating, fraud, skullduggery. But like, for example, the faith healing experiences you've had. Can we talk about that for a moment and what that might potentially indicate?
That was the most extraordinary experience of touring and doing a live show that I've had. So a few years before, I did a documentary called Miracles for Sale, where I trained somebody up to be a healer, and then we tried to pass him off as a real one out in Dallas. But I kind of got the bug for doing it, so this show Miracle, which is on Netflix now, just throwing that out. I tried to do that casually, it didn't sound very convincing, but it's on Netflix. So in it, I do this faith healing, evangelical faith healing. I didn't think it was really going to work enough. I thought there are certain tricks that these healers use. I thought, I know I can get to the end of, like, a kind of a routine, so enough to try it. But I didn't really think, given that the audience are skeptical like me, they're not coming there expecting healing, they're not coming there believing in healing, and I was staggered that it really worked.
What are the basic tricks, Derren?
What makes it work?
The basic tricks at the beginning, like where you go, I'm looking for someone called Derren. I'm looking for someone. Someone's passed over the other side? Is it just that they're very open questions that, by law of averages, is that the technique?
That sort of thing, which is like psychic readings and mediumships. Yeah, you're just. There's so many different ways of doing that kind of thing. There's basically hot reading and cold reading. So cold reading would be, I mean, you see it all the time. You throw out a name. I'm getting the name Janet. That could be someone who's died. It could be someone who's sat there. It could be a friend at home who knows someone has died, or it could be anything. And then the person goes, oh, yes, that's me. That was my sister. And then the psychic goes, that's right. She's saying she's coming through for her sister. And then why
did you say that in the first place?
Why did you say that in the first place? Would be a really good response.
Because I also know Janet. And it's nearly going to be me that said it.
Exactly. So that's... Yeah, there's that.
So those techniques are basically almost could be used in sales or could be used in any format.
Exactly.
Techniques
That's
for establishing
reading.
rapport.
Hot reading is when you have information on the person. So there was a very famous psychic called Doris Stokes, who...
I remember her.
Yeah. So she was a really sort of inoffensive, lovely old lady, sort of was her kind of character. But I heard of somebody who got called up by her people. This is the story I heard. Because this woman had lost a son, I think, in a drowning accident, and had been in the local papers. And Doris Stokes' team called her up and said, "Oh, Doris has a message for you from your son. So, would you she'd like you to come to the event?" And she said, "Oh, well, can she not just give me the message now, or can you pass on?" No, she'd really like you to come to the event. We've got a seat for you. Can you wear a red jumper so that she can spot you easily? So this woman goes along, and then, of course, during the show, it's, "Oh, there's a lady over this, the lady in the red jumper over there. I'm sensing your son died." And, of course, she just gives all the information that was, just in the paper. And it looks like something that, with this woman's experience of it, is very different. She felt very sort of violated by it. And you see that all the time. The worst version of that, I think, is with the TV studio psychics. So I've seen this, that the guy comes out, so before they start filming, he's got a studio audience and says, "Is anybody hoping anyone's going to come through?" And hands go up, and he just goes around asking people, "Who are you hoping will come through? Is there some bit of evidence I could give you that would be proof that it's real?" And of course these people want no reason to be cynical, tell him everything he needs to know, and then the cameras start rolling and he just says all that stuff back to them, and they burst into tears, and it's horrible. So that's hot reading. That's when you've got the information and you're passing it off as, psychic. And cold reading is when you're saying things in a way that people make fit. So that's that. Healing, the evangelical healing was very different. And what was going on there, well, it wasn't about information that people are making fit. It was about a kind of quite physiological experience. So I got the audience to get a bit of adrenaline going with a bit of a sort of positive visualization and some music and lights, because adrenaline's a painkiller, right? And when you go and see these healers, these are evangelical faith healers and people being slain in the spirit, they call it, falling back on stage, all of that stuff. There's always a lot of adrenaline in the songs and a lot of emotional manipulation first. And then, so that was one part of it. And the other part of it that then makes it work is interrupting people's story of their pain and their ailment. So, as I was telling your lovely wife Laura earlier on today, there was a woman that came up in the first week who had been paralysed down one side of her body since she was a kid, and she was in floods of tears because she could move her arm for the first time.
But these people, your audience, they're not coming for Doris Stokes
or
for some evangelist. They're like Derren Brown.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I was so surprised that this worked. But I just say to people, just enter into this, and the results are interesting. Just do what I say, and we'll see what happens. And you're only dealing with a small percentage, right? So if you take 2,000 people, and then you filter the people out of that respond, and then the ones that are best responding out of that, and you get them up on stage, you're only dealing with a small percentage. Plus, so like this woman, like she's moving her arm, and she, her feeling, all that's come back. And then, even then you think, well, maybe that's only going to last for the 10 minutes she's on stage. But I still hear from people years later saying, just so you know, that did properly heal. So there's nothing going, like, I'm not healing them. If you've had an x-ray before and afterwards, nothing's changed. But the psychological component of suffering is what's interesting. And for some people and some ailments and, some situations, that's enough to turn something around because they've lived out a story. Like, it sounds silly, but I had a bursitis in my shoulder for a long time. So it basically meant I couldn't really move my left shoulder very well. So when I put a jacket on, I've got used to sort of making this arm dead and pulling the sleeve up with the other arm. I don't need to do that anymore, but I do it because I've got so used to doing it. It's become part of a habit. And if somebody said, your arm is healed, go on, move it around, now see what it's like. Can you put a jacket on? Can you put a jacket? I'd be like, oh, how did you do that? I can move it, And it's just the story that I've been living out. So I think it was probably that, but,
Yeah, but you've obviously got it seems to me that you've got, because it wasn't just one person that got healed, it's a number of people that got healed.
Every night.
You're healing people every night!
Yeah.
Right, so obviously, like what you just told me there with the jacket story, it's good that you have this sort of quizzical perspective, but it seems that your bias is precisely the opposite. It's a materialistic bias that's towards rationalism. There must be a rational explanation to this, i.e. an explanation that I can understand. And this might seem like an odd comparison, but I think it'll make sense as I explain it. Like, I'm friendly with Noel Gallagher out of Oasis, right? And if you ask Noel about, like, what does that song mean? And what does that bit mean of that song? He goes, John Noel just fucking said it, right? He'll never go, oh, well, I was just trying to allude to right? But the fact is that in that music, there's the evocation of certain feelings and moods and states, and whether or not Noel cops to that or acknowledges it or even is aware of it, it's there.
Yeah.
Right? And it seems to me that if you're healing people on stage, whether you're healing them from the perspective of exposing it or not, you're healing people. And well, of course, there's one example of, like, yes, they were unconscious, that the capacity for them to move their arm had long been realised and they didn't bring it into their own knowledge, whatever. But another possibility is, like with placebos everywhere, that somewhere in the body are we know that the body heals itself anyway. If I cut myself, it's going to heal itself. Just don't know how to access that data. I mean, there would be a rational explanation for those things if I had a better brain and different senses. So is it possible also that, like a kind of placebo, people being told, heal that arm now, if they sort of, it's Derren Brown, I see him do some magic shit on the telly, like, they might just obediently heal their body.
Well, I did have a mad moment of thinking, well, I'm sure I could pack out the O2. I mean, like, we could sell the show as a secular healing show. I make no claims. It doesn't work on everybody, but it certainly works on some people. But then that's when you start to go mad. Because it's not about reducing it, saying, oh, it's only this, because it clearly is, like, potentially life-changing for these people, but it's only a smallish number of people. It's very hard to evaluate exactly what the percentage was. So that's
probably diabetes drugs that work on 10% of people that are available on the market.
Yeah,
you know what I mean, if it was coming from underwritten by a pharmacological or commercial,
it'd be a very different thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
But what is important, I think, it was like this. This is a real effect. For me, it felt more important to be able to sort of isolate that and go, look, I'm seeing this work every night, and what this points to is something interesting about the psychology of suffering. That's more of a useful place than, well, I'm doing it, let's say it's for real, so let's advertise this as a healing show and have poor, people dragging themselves. I mean, I've been to these healing shows where people get children dragged around the country by their parents with, kids with, say, Down syndrome. That is not going to get healed on that stage. That's, an amputee. That arm isn't going to grow back. And people in hospital beds that were being dragged around. I mean, it's just horrible. It's such a vile scene. So you don't want to go, well, hey, look, it's real because it's happening. I think it's more useful to go, hang on, what is happening, and then how is that useful? It's not about reducing it and saying, oh, it's just this or just that, because it clearly was happening. But
something unanticipated and beyond our sort of current understanding of the way that healing works occurred.
I think it's well understood. I mean, I've spoken to doctors and physios and people like that about it quite a lot since. Everyone seems to get it. But I think in terms of what it looks like, which is why it lends itself so well to a stage show, because it looks like magic. In the same way hypnosis looks like magic, it's all kind of the same thing. But actually what's going on is probably quite ordinary, a little difficult to sort of pin down, but it comes out in this sort of experience that does look amazing, probably looks more amazing than it feels sometimes.
Right, it's theatrically rewarding.
Yeah.
Are there any of your sort of techniques that you used to do sort of at the beginning of your career and are therefore now redundant that you can sort of talk about sort of explicitly, saying, well, all I really do is I use that phrase, and then they're listening and they've heard that phrase, so it seems that I'm predicting what they're going to say, but actually I've throughout the conversation been stitching into it? Are there things that are going, oh, right, that could make us understand how rudimentary and rational these things are?
Well, it's a mixture. So I started off as a hypnotist, and then but it was difficult actually trying to make a living as a student doing hypnosis. So I got into, thank you, poured me another water, thank you so much. So I got into doing close-up magic. So it's always been a mixture of both things, like magic tricks dressed up as psychology, and then suggestion and psychology sometimes dressed up as magic tricks. It's a bit of a blur. And when I do my stage shows now, they are about, kind of creating an effect like the healing. But the healing that's a good example. It's a mixture of, those techniques I was talking about the adrenaline and the affecting people's way of, the living out their stories. That's real. But there were also some tricks I was using in there as well, which I'd learned from healers, which they're just fraudulent tricks. So one I had tried on me was leg lengthening. So they and if you
gotta get these legs lengthened.
Yeah, if you type into YouTube leg lengthening healing,
Why do people want that?
Well, the thing is, so a healer will say to you sometimes, and you know they're just an out and out fraud if they do this, because there's no way of like hiding the fact you are just cheating. They'll say, "Oh, you see, he walks with that limp, so he doesn't walk with a limp." And they said this to me: "Oh, he walks with a limp. Let's heal that. I don't walk with a limp." That's because one leg is longer than the other, and they get you up on stage. They stick your legs out. And as they turn to the audience and say, "Look at this," or turn to the camera and say, "Come in closer," they pull one of it sounds so stupid, one of the heels off your shoes. Only ever people with like loose-fitting shoes or slip-ons, to make one leg look a little longer, right? So the heels come out a bit further. But all the attention's on the other foot where the heel is pushed in normally. And they say, "Look, this leg's too short. So we're going to make this leg grow out." And then while all attention is on that leg, they slowly push the heel on the other leg that you're not really paying as much attention to. You're already sort of, measuring against it. They slowly push that in. But because all the attention's on the other leg, they're not doing anything with it. It's oddly kind of convincing. And then they make you run around and say, "Look, there's no limp. His leg is healed." And I've been on the receiving end of this, and I've done it myself. So there are tricks like that they use, and I suppose with what I saw is a mixture of that. Yeah.
Yours is a mixture of that sort of sleight of hand, distraction, and
suggestion. I've just always found it interesting. I think ultimately my toolkit is sort of the stories that people tell themselves. That's kind of, and the best tricks are sometimes just a word that I change, and it creates like a whole massive effect out of nothing other than a bit of language, which is really without actually sort of going, I did this and then this happened. It's hard to do that, because I have to sort of keep some things, I guess, a bit secret, because it's
your livelihood.
It's my livelihood. And I still do that, stuff on stage. The TV shows are different now. They've kind of moved into real people going through real dramas, and I'm kind of more of a backstage string puller, I guess, which I quite like, because magic always sort of felt like it, dramatically, it's just vapid. You're just going, "Look at me, aren't I clever? I can make anything happen," which is, there's no drama in that at all.
Yes.
There's no hero struggling.
Sometimes it's naff. I mean, whilst like one of the, like I was sort of on the surface of it, which is not always a bad place to be, like the aesthetics of what you did were interesting in the way that sort of David Blaine was an evolution, or further back David Copperfield was an evolution, or Houdini. Like I know you're you're a student of all of this stuff, but yours presenting it in a sort of a rational and like sort of, I would say, sort of in a sense stripping back the mystery of it. I thought that was quite fascinating. Another thing that occurs when you're saying this, do you ever feel that you've somewhat fetishized the rather microscopic industry of faith healers and sort of hullabaloo, contrasted with the mass con practiced on the entire population of, "This Coca-Cola is going to make you feel young," or "This Apple product, if you don't have it, you're not good enough," or "Buy this magazine, you should be like," so these techniques of suggestion and evoking certain states through adrenaline, they're not only happening in a sort of that sort of rather ancillary, quaint way of the snake oil salesman. They're happening the great blocks of human consciousness smashed into annihilation by sort of a commercialized consumerist culture, which I think is a sort of what do I want to say, sort of saturation point, a kind of a peak experience. Do you think about that, the comparisons of your ability to manipulate and social and cultural versions of that?
Yeah. So I think partly that comes from the fact that if I'm going to, the targets or the subjects I'm going to look at, if I'm going to, debunk them or recreate them or whatever, need to have a certain kind of theatrical quality to them, because if I'm performing and doing those things, so it's easier to recreate faith healing than it, say, would be to look at those issues like in the form of a theatre show, and to an extent even the form of a TV show, the sort of things that I do. Where I think I also lack a little bit of the, I don't know if it's just the balls or the sort of sense of mission with some of those bigger things. I kind of quite like. I don't like sticking my head too much above the parapet and getting shot at. It's just not quite me, so I tend to go for these things.
Why that? You're a sweet, shy man.
I'm sweet and shy. I'm an accommodator. That's probably why. I'm just naturally quite accommodating. But I do think though that so like take the faith healing. What you've got in the interesting thing to me about the faith healing, aside from how it works or doesn't work, is the faith model that's there. So you have to believe that post-healing, right? People are sent off, throw your pills away, and if the illness comes back, it's because you didn't believe enough. You didn't maintain your belief and faith that God had healed you, right? So of course it's going to come back the vast majority of the time, and so you have this sort of cycle of self-blame. But that's exactly the same as the law of attraction, for example. It's the same thing. Rhonda Byrne says quite specifically in The Secret that you put this belief out into the universe. If the universe doesn't provide it, it's because you haven't committed yourself fully to that belief, and it is your fault. And that so although it is a quaint, silly, strange niche thing, faith healing, it is, I think, it's a symptom of a kind of a way of thinking, which I think taps right into sort of our obsession with optimism and self-belief and goal setting and all those things, which ultimately just leaves us feeling like we've failed when they don't quite come together.
In a sense, American individualism through capitalism has a comparable message. If you don't succeed, if you're poor and your house has just been foreclosed, you should have worked harder, because look at Kobe Bryant. He's fucking brilliant. He's good at basketball. Well, be good at basketball. I'm not tall enough. Exactly. It's sort of like it's a... I suppose this isn't something I imagined us talking about prior to this conversation, but I recognise that the template is comparable. We were talking another thing before you came, and my wife and her mates were talking about, with some excitement, may I say, your imminent arrival. One of the things that we talked about is like, why don't Derren Brown take over the world? Right. Like you could sort of like, why don't take over a big corporation or a country or something? Is that because? Why is that?
I've never had any ambition at all, and I think it's, on the one hand, has been good for me, but on the other hand, it means that I spend most of my time being asked to do things, speak at things, and just declining them because I suppose because they're a challenge or that's a bit of a stress, and I'm very good at avoiding anything that's stressful. Hence, writing a book on Stoicism, essentially, which resonates very well if you're very good at avoiding stress, but. Which is sort of the flip side of it, isn't it? I think I like the fact I've never been ambitious. I never, like wanted to have the TV show or wanted to do this, wanted to do that. I was just open to them. But what I only ever wanted was to just be enjoying myself from day to day, and
just put it out into the universe.
Just put it out in the universe.
I wouldn't mind a TV show.
But that's. Yeah, so that's.
You don't feel very driven. You're quite happy with.
I've never. No.
How is your anxiety and fear and all that kind of thing? You're good with that now.
Yeah, I've never really had. I get. I know I can get a bit if. I know when I do get stressed, and it's normally because I want time on my own to read or stuff I need to do, and. Other things are interfering with that, and I know it makes me quite curt and not very nice to be around. So I know it happens. So it's not like I don't ever get stressed, but I just don't really try and set my expectations at a level, maybe it's kind of just realistic, that, things don't always work out how you want them to.
When and why and how did you make the decision to, whilst I understood what you said from talking to your mate who was a sort of into psychic stuff, that you recognised that as a paradigm, it felt familiar to your sort of belief in Christianity. What point did you throw it off, and at what point did you decide to wholly embody the man that you are, with regard to your sexuality and your whole being, and how?
That was kind of around 30.
Which is surprising, isn't it? Is it?
Yeah, I think it is. But yeah, somewhere around there, and because look, it's not going to change now, and I don't want to have, don't want to be in a situation where I'm turning up to an event with my partner, because I was seeing some at the time, and then it just being like a sort of a secret, or like a weird, thing. So I sort of came out. But I'd had a friend take me out for dinner, and he came out to me. But he made it was such a big, serious thing for him. And I just remember thinking, almost obliged to say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, how terrible," because it was like he was taking his friends out for dinner one at a time. So I thought, okay, well, if I do this, I need to just treat it lightly and forget the fact that it feels such a huge, heavy weight on me, because it isn't to other people. And that's the real lesson, that people just don't care. They don't care. It's of no interest at all.
Why did it feel heavy?
Because you carry around, and obviously I speak for myself, and it might be vastly different now, but I'd certainly carried around a lot of shame about it, which is and then when you do that, when you carry around a sort of a guilty sense of like, oh God, you develop, a bit like all the ways I've found ways of avoiding the sore shoulder, sort of maladaptive measures for the rest of the body to accommodate for that. So you get very good at finding ways of diverting from those conversations and never having to really address it. And I think that horrible sort of 70s cliche of the gay man being, the hairdresser or the interior decorator or the actor or the fashionista or whatever, I think comes from, there's an element of truth in it, because you get very good at putting on a dazzling surface,
wow,
dressing oddly or whatever. And for a long time I was sort of... I think I was doing that. And magic's a great way of doing that. Why be this sort of interesting, controlling magician figure? I mean, that's a great way of diverting conversation from what size tits do you like, which is sort of occasionally people would try and tie me down on those questions. And I didn't
You're
really
moving in
know
some
how to
strange
answer.
circles. One, it was a circle where you weren't able to be open about your sexuality, and secondly, you were hanging out with chauvinists.
Yes, exactly. But I think they were trying to cut to the core.
Look, let's cut to the core, Derren.
Yes.
Is it 34B? Are we talking double H? What are you into, man?
Yeah.
Never mind these card tricks. Let's look at this catalogue of braziers. So, are you from a small place, a small town, or?
I grew up in Purley, which is real sort of Daily Mail suburbia.
Yeah, and there wasn't access to, because I feel like obviously I've started to query these kind of boundaries and these terms more as sort of post-structuralist thought sort of kicks in and stuff. But so even before saying I'm a heterosexual, but what I mean to say is I've never had sex with anyone other than women. But I feel like I still have had sort of sense of shame about myself, and I feel like, in a way, like my journey was like a first thing I found was, oh right, I'm a performer, then I'm a drug addict, then all right, I can't do these drugs anymore, it's killing me, and then it was the sort of interfacing in an ever-evolving way with what it means to be, inverted commas, spiritual, which has for me come down to basically open-mindedness, connectedness, kindness, quite sort of simple ideas, although I can do bloody complicated versions if that's what you're into. But like what I feel for you when you say this, it feels to me like you went an unusually long time without people connecting to you in a way where you felt safe.
Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, I am a bit of we're all a bit of a loner, but I'm a bit of a loner. I think also I played on my own when I was young, because my brother's like 9 years younger than me, and I think if you play a lot alone as a kid, you tend to bring that with you as well into later life. Yeah. So I'm definitely, a little on the introverted side.
Are you a good communicator in your relationship now?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think so. Oh, yeah, relationships are interesting, aren't they? Because they all the madness that you carry with you. I think the principal value of being in a relationship is that other person going, you can't do that. That's mad. You can't just be that person. You're in a relationship now, because otherwise you just kind of crustate, don't you? Develop a shell around you of all this just unacceptable behaviour. And so it's, and now I said I'm sort of 48, so I find myself a little bit caught between that kind of Nietzschean urge of become who you are. Like there's this version of myself that I should be heading towards, and everyone else needs to clear out the way to let me do it. Versus the opposite of that, which is like, well, maybe the best version of myself is right now in the relationships that I've got. I've got a partner I love and 2 dogs that I love, and the sort of domestic ordinariness maybe is kind of a good thing. But the two do feel slightly pulling and pushing in different directions. But that's kind of that's interesting, and I think that's where relationships really important. Like letting relationship change you rather than just obsessing as to whether or not you're supposed to change the other person.
Yes,
being open to change and somebody making you revise your presumptions of what's normal.
I'm lucky in that I have a sort of an ideology that has a degree of flexibility in it, i.e. specifically 12-step ideology, which is sort of, obviously about, in my case, abstaining from drugs and alcohol, but is in a way quite a holistic philosophy that you run every problem and relationship through a sort of a system that involves inventory, confession, restitution, quite sort of fundamental and basic principles. But it really helps me with stuff like it incorporates, don't try and change a person you're in a relationship with. If you don't like that person, don't be in a relationship with them. Or it's you can change you can't change anybody else. And that it's nice that I have that as a reference point, because my tendency is, hey, would you not do anything like that? I'd like you to become like this. That's my general, to be sort of quite, sort of dictatorial about how other people's behaviour. Now when I spot myself doing it, I'm willing to relinquish it. Well, so you were drawn to Stoicism when I've listened to you talking about it before, and it seems to me that, forgive me because I know you've studied it, it sounds to me like it's in a sense from a classical tradition, but encompasses a lot of ideas that we might recognise from Eastern philosophy.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Well, the first Stoics were from the East, so it's sort of taken some recognisably Buddhist ideas and let them sit in a quite Western rational sort of mode and language. And then interestingly, of course, Christianity came along and had to win the Stoics over, so 500 years later. So it kind of used a lot of Stoic ideas but Christianized them, like the idea of the dutiful citizen, which the Christian upstanding duty was actually a very Stoic idea. So you can sort of follow the sort of Eastern ideas up through Stoicism and then weirdly into Christianity.
How did they get into the classical world, these Eastern ideas?
The first Stoics just were coming over from Persia and places and were starting this
because of Hellenistic colonialism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was a real hodgepodge back then. But I think it's quite relevant nowadays, and it's definitely had a bit of resurgence. Cognitive behavioural therapy is based quite explicitly on Stoic principles, and that's very popular nowadays.
CBT, that just means, don't be ridiculous, you're not going to get hit by a bus, there's no buses on your street. Is it that? Is it like rationally think about what you're saying?
It's sort of it's kind of about just stepping into that throwing a spanner into these works between your kind of thoughts and your behaviour and kind of going, well, where can you stop that process and question some of these things. Stoicism is basically about not trying to control things that you're not in control of, which I'm sure rings bells with what you're doing at the moment. That, you're in control of your thoughts and your actions. Everything else, what other people do, how they let you down or how they, whatever, what they think of you, everything else isn't under your control. And actually, you can decide that all of those things are fine. It doesn't always come easily, that thought, and sometimes you have to really let it kind of drip into the soul and take hold. But all of the things out of your thoughts and actions you can decide are fine. Now, it gets complicated with matters of social injustice, for example, because you might really want to change something and create change in the world and not decide that it's fine. So then you distinguish again the same thing between, well, what am I in charge of? What's my thoughts and actions? So I can do the best that I possibly can to change that thing. I might devote my life to creating social change. So I can commit to that, but I won't commit to the outcome. I won't emotionally commit to an outcome that may happen a generation later. I may only be the starting point for it, or, again, easier said than done, but the basic idea is not trying to control things that are out of your control. And part of that then is also realizing that it's our reactions to things that create our problems, not the things themselves. And these are ideas that have drifted down
they're
a couple
in
of thousand
Christianity,
years.
and they're in 12
Exactly, yeah. And they're big ideas, but that's where they came from. And they came from these
cool.
The Stoa was the sort of porchway where they would stand and talk to people and bother them as they were walking past. So they just came from these guys standing around in Athens.
Have you considered that this might not be in your control? Just hanging around a doorway, quietly evangelical.
It's nice, isn't it? Yeah.
It's really beautiful. I suppose those kind of principles, hearing them now, they're in guard against imagination and hysteria, like a sort of, one aspect of the imagination is, of course, incredibly creative and wonderful, but another aspect of the imagination, and I believe there are classical terms for this, the imagination veritas and the imagination fantastico, I think it's something like that. The imagination fantastico. Oh my God, I could be eaten by a dragon. Oh no, I'm worried. Is that a lump? We could go crazy with fantasy, but also our imagination, of course, everything around us is being constructed through imagination, and to guard against hysteria. But there is, I see the incredible value of Stoicism, but when I heard you talk about it before, you said that even in studying it and writing about it, you started to, you said, feel the edges of it and the limitations of it. Was that to do with joy, or?
Yeah, what Stoicism gives you brilliantly is a robust sense of self. So it was born in a time of these Hellenic wars and strife and all these different cultures getting on or not getting on, but that real hodgepodge. It was very useful then. It's also very useful in terms of internal strife and just generally living in uncertain times and all of that. And that basic idea of not trying to control what's out of your control and deciding those things are fine. I mean, it is brilliant advice. But where they're not so hot where they're not so hot, things like kindness and a sense of community and so on. Now it does all loop back round into how you deal with other people, and into they were movers and shakers. They had a great sense of community, and it was all about how you get on with other people and so on. But they don't really. Their strength isn't in reaching out kindly. Their strength is all about fortifying the self. So I wrote this book called Happy that took me about 3 years of writing. Each year when I was on tour, I'd write a block of it, and for about a year before that, I'd sort of been reading the Stoics, so it had sort of become part of me and part of my kind of language, and it really resonated with me. I think if you're naturally quite introverted anyway, it really resonates, and it's it finds language for stuff that you felt but maybe thought you were foolish or childish for thinking, and then you go, oh no, here are grown-ups that have found a lovely way of saying it. So that was nice. But as I got to the end, things like the whole point is the reason for not trying to control these things that aren't under your control is to avoid disturbance, right? You're trying to create a sort of a tranquility. That was their model of happiness, which is great and so helpful a lot of the time. But disturbance and anxiety are really important as well, because how do you know that something is wrong? Like, how do you know that you need to change something unless you first of all it makes you feel anxious? How do you know whether you need to change your job? You need to change your job because it's only when the job feels and makes you unhappy that you need to change it. So actually, what's I think more useful is like letting anxiety sit comfortably within you and letting that be part of your integrated sense of who you are. That's more important, I think, than just trying to avoid it, because then there's a fine line between that and you never grow, or you just never kind of move forward because you think anxiety is always something to be avoided. So I still think it really holds up, but they're just as you said, just the edges of it that I thought, well, there's other things that are important. Finding meaning in life, they're not really big on meaning particularly. The importance of anxiety, importance of kindness and so on, they're just other things that are really worth exploring too.
Yes, like as you say, often I'm trying, like, whilst like a lot of what you have said is practically embedded in the systems that I use to cope with my own somewhat tumultuous inner life. You know, that avoidance of disturbance seems necessary for my character type, you know, but I can see also the necessity for being open to anxiety in order, like, you know, these, I try to think of it as best I can with the limits I have from an evolutionary perspective of what is the function of fear, what is the function of anger. These things have some sort of biochemical or primal function. You know, all of us must live in this state of translation, with living as we do with a biochemical anatomical system designed for a completely different
era.
And here we are trying to tackle it and cope with it, and it seems that there is an enormous disjunct broadly. I mean, civilization in a sense is the description of that disjunct. You were designed to live in these conditions, but now you live in these conditions, and many of those things fantastic. So many beautiful things about culture, architecture, medicine, technology, science, so many beautiful things. But sometimes when it comes to the inner life of an individual or the behavior of communities and collectives, there is this jarring dichotomy between who we actually are and the life we're living, which I sometimes experience on occasion when I glance at politics, which I seldom do these days. I'll sometimes just see them. I remember when I was a kid watching, like, it was the first time when I was about sort of 16, I guess, they started to put House of Commons on the telly at night.
I remember that,
and it was like a big deal, wasn't it, that they'd put cameras in there, and like I had taken some acid, and I remember like watching it and having this very raw experience of, that can't be what's happening. To run, that's the you're watching the process. As I've become older and somewhat integrated what were once quite tangential psychic experiences into sort of my dominant perspective, I see sort of, for example, Theresa May speaking, and I think, oh my God, you can't be in charge. Go sit down, have some tea, relax for a minute.
Nice spa weekend. That's what she needs.
She did a spa weekend, some reading. Everyone just be nice to this person. She's clearly under a great deal of stress. Now, that whole system, and don't blame yourself, this entire system of government cannot possibly work. What are you trying to work with an ideology dreamt up 500 years ago? It's not going to work anymore. Now, come on, let's have a serious attempt at a better idea. All of us, stop panicking. Don't be self-interested. You're coming from your ego. You know, like, sort of, it feels to me that there are sort of giant tracts of humanity that are evolving beyond the systems that we operate within, but those systems are sort of governed by people with vested interest in their sustenance. So it's quite difficult to oppose them. I had a go once, do you remember?
Yes, you did. You did.
A terrible headache.
I imagine. Oh, it's nice to know you've so you've turned all that down as far as you're
leaving that alone for a little while until I'm a bit more grounded and rooted and absolutely certain of what it is we're supposed to be doing.
Well, that's another thing, isn't it? I think. And another reason why somebody might be skeptical of something like Stoicism is just that it's an ism. And I think I'm quite happy for the sort of, you know, there's Stoicism that's against anxiety, but also the importance of anxiety. I think embracing the fact, look, we've always been very good versus evil. We've always had this sort of, you know, binary thing: God, Satan, good, evil, right and wrong. And we could probably do with a bit more yin and yang. You know, the life is messy and it's complicated, and we have to be able to balance, I think, opposites and ambivalence and ambiguity, and we're terrible at that. We don't like it, and it's for, you know, a number of obvious reasons. We're not very good at doing it, but that's part of growing up. When you're a baby, you scream, and hopefully somebody brings you what you want, and that's how you start life. And ideally, the mother is gradually sort of, or the caregiver is sort of letting you down slowly, making you realise that you're not always going to get. You know, this is Donald Winnicott, who was sort of a successor to Freud, had this lovely idea of the good enough mother. Freud had created this idea that, you know, the mothers had to be sort of perfect because, you know, your kids were just being ruined by everything. So much damage was being done by everything. And Winnicott very nicely said, no, it's just, you've got to be good enough. You actually have to let your kid down. You have to never quite give them everything they want so that they learn that life isn't like that. So what that means is getting older and maturing. Growing up is about tolerating ambiguity and having an ambivalence and having room for that. Room for things just being complicated and they're not being, you know, they're not being simple answers or one ism that will give you everything. Don't you agree?
I totally agree. Krishnamurti goes, truth is a pathless land, that each of us have our own individual
He's a newsreader. What does he know?
Well, I'm not talking about Krishna Guru Murthy.
You're talking about the Guru Krishnamurti.
Hey! Well done.
Thank you.
That's good punning.
That was good punning.
Really good.
I said it quite quietly because I wasn't quite confident getting the name right.
Yeah.
I swallowed it a bit, but hopefully you can lift it in
We'll
the
lift those levels, Derren. Often a pun, one can be reticent to use it in this day and age, but a good one like that, especially, that's not the first time I've brought up Krishnamurti, and it ain't the first time that the person has responded, the newsreader, but it is the first time that someone's gone the Guru Krishnamurti.
Thank you.
We're through the looking
That's
glass now, Derren.
I'm now helping myself to a cashew.
You're moving to denser, fattier snacks by way of reward. Yeah, truth is a pathless land, meaning that there's sort of, like you said, the sort of ambiguity of our inner lives is likely to require more than a sort of a one-size-fits-all ideology. That ideologies themselves are not the answer. I've been listening to a lot of stuff, mate, that's about we must embrace our individual experience as the guide. And to tell the truth, it's Terence McKenna, who I absolutely adore. He's a sort of he's dead now, but he was very much into plant medicines, but one of the most lucid and brilliant talkers and thinkers. You should check him out. He's got a very sort of humorous voice, I must say. But he talks about a lot about we're having our sort of consciousness prescribed to us, and we're not being given access to our birthright as free. He would query the term citizens, because citizen embedded in that term is the fact that we're conditioned and that our realities are dominated and governed, and we're not just talking about freedoms as in freedom of sort of sexual expression, freedom of cultural expression, but like that we're choosing from a very limited palette before we even know it, which is something that I'm sort of, I try to incorporate these rather more maverick outsider thinkers with, as best I can, not conventional when you talk about Michel Foucault, but with academic thinkers, sort of in this case post-structuralists, who would invite you to query and deconstruct the narratives that we take for granted, most obviously in this day and age, sort of like white colonial imperialist narratives, which are sort of now being queried, but like Foucault would take it even deeper about the structure of power and the dynamics between the powerful and the powerless, and how sort of diffuse and odd that is. So essentially where this is all leading, Derren, is do you want to do some hallucinogenic drugs?
Is there something in the cashews?
They're laden with lysergic
I was going to say, they're quite zesty, aren't they? Quite zingy.
Strap in, Derren. We're off. I hope you've kept some of them hypnotic skills, because I'm a very nervous traveller.
But that process you've spoken about is exactly the human process, isn't it? We mentioned Jung earlier on, but Jung said the greatest burden a child bears is the unlived life of its parents. So from an early age, we are taking on board a load of messages that we receive, and we're too young to question about, basically messages that come down to you are powerless and the world is powerful. This is your relation as a small being to this big world. This is what it wants from you. And then we grow up with that in place, a kind of a skewed compass, and then we make things fit that, and the same problems repeat themselves in our relationships, because we're actually just, without realizing we're doing it, looking for what feels familiar, or we get addicted to certain things, or obsess over things, or avoid certain things. And it's obviously what Jung was very keen on was that we integrate all of these. The self is something that's whole and integrated, because when we try and shut off aspects of ourselves, they become these the shadow, the parts of us that are uncomfortable, but it's the unconscious parts of us that own us, of course. And the goal of I think certainly Jungian therapy, I think generally therapy is to not necessarily grab a cure, but it's to have a more meaningful dialogue with the self and all those different aspects of the self, and not just try and shut them off. So you're aiming for sort of a consciousness, but it's a consciousness of these things that are otherwise unconscious, parts of yourself that need to be brought into the mix and honoured, which is why the Greeks with their gods, I mean, they did it so well that they didn't really believe that these gods were God in the way that we think of God nowadays. They were aspects of the self, essentially, that needed honouring. So you would honour the goddess of whatever, the god of creativity or eros, because if you didn't, that bit's going to come back and bite you, which is what happens in the self. The TV evangelist who rages against homosexuality and then gets caught in bed with a Ren boy sometime later, and his career's over. Same thing, just shutting off one aspect of his personality.
Turns out I was a bit gay during that and I overreacted. Yeah, that's right. And
it's the same thing. It's the narratives. We're living by those narratives, but it's just exactly what you were saying, but just internally.
Sometimes, yes, I completely agree. It's, in fact, easier to observe, the narrative of Christianity is not fitting in with my experience, and then one evolves your own narrative that incorporates our understanding of who we really are in relation to Christianity and what we reject. But it is still a narrative that we've constructed that will similarly have blind spots in it. So, of course, none of us know of what our unconscious mind is constituted by its
virtue of the fact it's unconscious. Yeah,
it's pretty difficult to incorporate.
So what does it mean to you now? What does Christianity mean to you now? What's your as an interesting and grown up and thoughtful person, what's your interesting and grown up thoughtful version of a religious belief that maybe very different from
because
else?
Christianity encompasses so many texts beyond its central canon, the Old and New Testament. I'm fascinated by the contributors such as Augustine and Aquinas, and also when I have conversations with clerics, I try to see, where are you at with this story? I find literalism quite difficult to take because by its nature it's limiting. So when I think of the figure of Christ, I approach it as I have no problem with the idea that God may have come to earth in human form, but I don't quite know how to deal with that in 2019 other than the potential, that perhaps God is awareness, perhaps the very phenomena of being a person that can experience having a body, having a mind, having senses, feeling emotions is a connection to God, and that if we could somehow embody this, if we could somehow ascend, if we can die on the cross to the flesh self and be reborn as the person that lives moment to moment in awareness and awakeness. And I, like you, because obviously if you're interested in Jung, it's likely you're interested in sort of, and I see here in the notes, archetypes and myth and perennialism. One of these guys I meditate as much as I can, and I've been meditating with this on YouTube with this guy Mooji, just listening to his videos. Mooji, well good meditations they are. And he's very good at getting you quite quickly to acknowledge you've not got anything to do. He's sort of got a West Indian, I think, accent. You got nothing to do. You're not trying to achieve anything, and you're not trying to get away from anywhere. Just experience your awareness. Experience your awareness. And then he sort of seems to time very well. Okay, now it's natural to have thoughts. That neither push those thoughts away nor follow them. And he, over the course of these meditations that I've been listening to, it has established in me this idea of, I see that my awareness is separate from every single belief about myself. There was one where he said, you are not just a vessel for concepts. For the concept, I am a man, I am English, I like this, I don't like that. You are. If all these concepts are being put in there is some space that they're being put into. Yes. And through this practice, which, again, the reason I mentioned perennialism is there is some consistency every type of meditation I've ever done as a paradigm, whether it's transcendental meditation or the stuff I've done with Andy Puddicombe's thing, Headspace, they're all ultimately start saying to you, but who is the witness? But who is the observer?
Yeah. The moment you go... I am having these feelings, then there's something having those feelings. So the feelings are not you, there's something you have, and that gives you a bit of space and leverage, I find, to sort of take a breath and not be overwhelmed by whatever feelings happen to be, because they're just things that you're having, so therefore they'll come and go.
Yes, and this again, like, Rumi talked about that, which pertains to one of the things we talked about earlier, like, like I am a guest house, come in anxiety, come in jealousy. Ooh, you might want to revise your guest policy at this, but like the suggestion that we are somehow being inhabited by these humans, and again, like you have said about the Greek gods, or like a genius like Shakespeare, like I see that Queen Mab hath been with you, she is the fairies' midwife. These entities, these energies, we are temporarily occupied by them, but we are not them. And as I'm raising children at the moment, and when I'm talking to a 2-year-old, I'm sort of aware of how much is wrapped up in syntax and the language that I'm giving her. Because they're so new and she's just learning language, I'd already told myself, don't teach her to say things like I am angry. Try to teach her to sort of recognise that temporarily she is feeling anger. But frankly, she doesn't have enough grammatic complexity yet to
idiot.
I'm not. If she doesn't crack it in another week, I'm going to get another one. That's what I promised myself. A very clever child, and I'm not going to yield on that, Derren.
And was I don't know what the timeline is, but in terms of you kind of embracing that belief and a belief in God, was that part of that? Was that part and parcel of a 12-step program? Did it predate it, or is it all kind of part of the same thing? I guess at some level it is.
In a sense, I can trace a line, as it were, because like part of it was like you as a kid, I was always playing on my own. So this sense of, who is this in here that's always present? Who's feeling these things? And then when I became a drug addict, and part of that was like sort of recreational hallucinogens and stuff, and experiencing, hold on, I'm still here, but I know that Russell is not real, none of our constructs are real, and I know that the dimension of the sensory realm is but a limited frequency because I am beginning to experience these frequencies. Then I wasn't allowed to take no more drugs because I was overreacting to them and overdoing them, so I had to stop. But then through meditation and yoga, not so dense and immediate or as vivid, but in a rather more sort of subtle and gentle way, I began to experience it. And I've been doing these breath techniques recently as well, and through them, like experiencing altered states of consciousness, but where the observer, the witness, is still present. And somehow, to me, these states are connected to ideas such as love and kindness and oneness, which I sort of, again, I'm making these connections, but it sort of resonates with stuff I've read in sort of C.S. Lewis. I'm sure when he writes in Mere Christianity, that when we talk about morality, which I think any atheist would be fine with, like, when we talk about morality, it's a sort of an inborn sense that, oh, don't do that, that's out of order. And from, again, someone might say, no, that's evolutionary psychology and reciprocal altruism and all that. And for me, this is just a deliberate sort of like demystifying and no, we did that because back in the tribe, if you help someone, they might give you a coconut in a couple of months. Like, I feel like, well, why? Don't go out of your way to say people are arseholes. We've got enough of that in the Old Testament. Like, the sins of the father will be visited on the like these narrative templates, whether they're presented atheistically or theologically, have either you can be optimistic about human beings, we are beautiful and we will succeed and we love one another, or you can say, no, humans are just wankers, and I can't take that.
Or it can be both, can't it? It's free will or not free will. You can actually say you can have both, and one is a language that's useful for understanding the situation from one aspect, and another is useful for understanding it from another perspective. But again, it's that thing of ambivalence and ambiguity being okay. Both can be true. Right. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Do you meditate then?
I don't.
Why?
No, I don't. And
what are you doing when you're telling people to clear off and leave you alone? Have a good meditate.
I read a lot. There's the Stoic form of meditation, premeditation, which is just taking a couple of minutes to think about the day ahead. I do that now rather than, go on my phone first thing in the morning.
Good.
And check Twitter.
Why won't you do a nice meditation?
I think...
I'm already being evangelical. You've said how much you're irritated by religion.
I think because I've always felt like I'm a bit of a stranger to anxiety and stress, which I may not be, but because of that, I've not for myself felt that I've needed it. I've certainly sort of tried it because it feels similar to self-hypnosis and so on.
Of course.
But like my partner, for example, has more of a kind of stress thing. That's more a thing in his life. So I've definitely recommended it to him and suggested he do it.
Why don't you do it together?
Or do it together. I think
a lovely
we'd
thing to
find
do
a way of
together.
arguing. I think during
You're not doing it properly.
yeah.
It's a very beautiful thing.
It's very beautiful and very useful and very sensible, I think.
Yeah, I'd like to know what would happen to your mind if you did it. I'd like to know what your experiences were.
I'd probably just
And
find
is that not motivation? I mean, mine probably, Derren. Half of mine to trap you here. I've been getting, because I suppose it's me.
I need a wee at some point.
You do that before it, or during, if necessary. I remember the very first time I met you, as a matter of fact, which was prior to the time I went round your house, you went round my house. There was this time where I was at the Soho Theatre, and you were in there. I'd just done a show, it was like a sort of 150-seat room. So it was a while ago. Let me let me tell you. So I remember I see you in a sat down. I was quite excited to see you, and I was like, "Oh, it's Derren Brown." I didn't we sat on the table next to you, and I didn't want to trouble you. But then I think someone needed a chair or something, and I took a chair from one. You know how you have to go. You're meant to go. Do you need this chair? I don't think I did that properly, and I went and got this chair. I think you asked me to get the chair, maybe, and I thought, fucking Derren Brown. He's Derren Brown me all over this bar. I'm getting chairs. I remember it caused some sort of kerfuffle. But, hey, that's my chair. And I went, hold on a minute. I don't remember doing this. What's going on?
I don't remember that.
It's Derren Brown.
I don't remember that at all. That's how I used to use my powers back in the day.
Just getting people to shuffle furniture around.
Just to shuffle up a bit so I could... Yeah. I remember seeing you at my show, because you'd stand out a bit.
Circus.
It was Cambridge Circus, because you're quite tall and distinctive. And I remember that being it really throwing me for most of the show, trying not to look.
I was really concerned that at some point I was going to be like, and now, Russell, you will come up here and you will take down your trousers and pants and do this little dance. Oh, shit. Now I'm doing a dance. It was bad enough when I had to move that chair.
See, I feel I can disappear quite easily. Whereas, I remember Stephen Fry talking about this, just saying, because it's quite, he's tall and you kind of can't miss him, and so he's had to kind of just embrace that a lot more in terms of being recognised and so on. And again, when I've seen you with people that come up and want to say hello, you're so brilliant and present, and is it I guess that has you've just had to make that part of. Is it different now you've moved out of London, by the way? Is that
it's posh round here, no one cares.
No one cares.
And which is, it's all right. But you were very good in the kitchen with my wife and her friends. You seem like sort of quite garrulous. I sometimes feel like that these sort of, whether or not it's a sort of a high-minded cultural or historical ideology that we're imposing on ourselves, or a sort of a parochial, local, individual belief, like I am shy, that in a sense we can... I was faking it with your wife. I didn't warm to her on any level. You destroyed me a second time. But you seemed there. I thought, look here. You seem sprightly, spry, warm, and at ease. Have you ever used these because it's interesting. Say I'm mates with Paul McKenna. I've not spoken to him for a long time actually, but he sort of transitioned from sort of stage hypnotist into the much more who's that dude, the NLP dude who's slightly scary, Richard Bandler, like NLP, because we're in the same wheelhouse. Once you're sort of saying, and I absolutely adore Tony Robbins, who seems to be able to just shoot lasers at you that turn you into sort of positivity. Have you ever considered that route?
I see. I'm not. That's where the shyness maybe kicks in. I think I'm not. Going back to those narratives that we live by from a young age. There are, as I'm sure you know, there are some big sort of personality types, and one big thing is: do you avoid stress, or do you move towards it? Do you move towards it to fix it, which says, roughly speaking, what my partner tends to do. He's great at sort of stuff needs to be sorted out, is on it. I avoid it constantly. So that's great for a kind of tranquil life, but it's not very good for motivating a room of people and becoming an international guru in motivation. I'm very happy if my if I've got a clean day in the diary, my phone never goes, and I can just sit and read, and that's it. That's like a really happy day for me. So no, I'm not constitutionally made to do it. I get asked, will you come and, give a sales talk to our team on how they can sell things better, or come and give some motivational team buildership thing? And I don't know what I'd say.
You should go and film it, because I think it'd be quite good to hear your lethargic, stoic approach to sales.
Well, exactly. And I think, if you think about stuff also, you just end up, it's like, politically, I guess I'm kind of bit liberal and a bit lefty, but all I can see is, well, that's part of the story. You're left wing, or this thing of like the right wing protects the group. I mean, they seem to me to be a bit like the baddies in some ways at the moment, but the right wing urge is to protect the group, and that's really important because sometimes we are groupish creatures, and you protect the group, but that can happen at the expense of weaker individuals. So then you've got the liberal urge, which is to protect those weaker individuals, which is really important, but that can happen at the expense of overall stability sometimes. So both sides are like, part of the story, and if you take the nasty individuals out of it, or people that you don't like, the key thing where you find truth and humanity is in the dialogue between the sides, right? Not just in one side or the other. Yes. So how do you begin to ally yourself to any strong political motivations? I just don't. Yeah. I just never settle down on any kind of opinion or whatever that is, motivation with enough force to do anything about it, because I'm quite happy just to go, it's complex and, difficult, and there's no easy answers. And if there are, I certainly don't have them.
You might be a bit enlightened in a very sort of unassuming way, because I've noticed a lot of people that are vibrating on a higher frequency, they tend not to get too worked up about sort of the mechanics of the materialistic world. Like sometimes I feel like, you see some glorious guru swathed in saffron, like hanging out with Bill Clinton or whatever, and I might think, well, can't you, but look at the things that have happened and the complex, and I sense that, like when I think about that, the spectrum of current, say, British political life, or to a degree American political life, the two sort of worlds I know, a bit about, not much, I would have to say. Like, I can strongly identify with people that feel that they've been cheated and swindled and overlooked and ignored and are angry. And similarly, my general sense is to be compassionate and loving and forgive, So, and also, though, that would of course have to extend to people that you disagree with. Otherwise, it is just a different type of tribal preservation.
We did a really interesting experiment. I did the show Sacrifice, which was which is also on Netflix now. So it's the last TV show that I did, and there's quite a lot. At the start of the show, there's this audition day, and there's like 100 people and I choose the guy I'm going to use. But we did a lot on that day, which never made the show. And one of the things we did was so that the room is actually divided between people who identify strongly left-wing and strongly right-wing. So we did some things. Could you get people to change their opinions, and what would it take? Based on the idea that one of the reasons why the conservatives, or at least right-wingers, tend to have, Republicans and so on, tend to have an electoral advantage, is that they hit a lot of moral trigger points for us. And there's a great book called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt that goes into this. So our feelings of, because they're about protecting the group, so that taps into our instinct for things like preserving authority and loyalty and so on. There's a bunch of sort of moral triggers that they tap into, whereas the liberal urge is mainly about compassion. That's sort of one note that tends to get hit, and because generally, like, Republican and right-wing rhetoric tends to hit a lot more like moral notes, they tend to have a bit of an electoral advantage and they get voted in more. However, so the point of this experiment is, by priming people with different with these sort of instincts, could you get them to change their socio-political views? So if you're protecting the group, which is the right-wing instinct, you're very sensitive to threat, right? Threat to the group. And so the first experiment we did was we flashed up loads and loads of images. Everyone's wired up to these clever things that can read their, micro this and sweating and so on. And sure enough, every time it sounds silly, but you flash up a picture of a puppy or a kitten or something that would make you feel compassionate, all the left-wingers fire up, right? They physiologically fire up. Nothing really happens on the right-wing side. When it's pictures of witches and ghosts and monsters and aliens, all the right-wingers, because it's
stealing our jobs.
It's threat, right? So that was like interesting, and it sort of was exactly what the research said would happen. So then we did this experiment, which is also part of written up in Jonathan Haidt's book, which is where the idea came from. So if you take your right-wingers who's if the basic idea is one of threat, that's kind of what they're predisposed to feel, right? Is they're more prone to feeling threat from outside. What if you made them feel invincible? So I just got them to imagine that they had a superpower that meant that they were impervious to harm, and just
you got them to imagine it, or you hypnotise them?
No hypnosis. Literally, just I'm reading a script. They close their eyes. And all of you just imagine this, and now fill out the questionnaire. And the questionnaire is asking for their socio-political views. They've answered these same questions before, worded a bit differently, so it's not obvious they're repeated.
Oh, cool!
But we've got their answers from before, and now we look at their answers after that 5-minute priming exercise to feel imaginatively less threat, right? To feel invincible. And their answers are more left-wing. We did the opposite thing with the left-wingers by inducing disgust, which is another kind of which is why all this, the sort of racist rhetoric and so on historically has always been tied in with
rats,
language, rats, dirt, and so on, vermin,
parasite, swarm.
So we literally had fake sick on the floor as they came in. There was rubbish and crap everywhere. The room stunk. We were apologising, saying there'd been an accident before, but we had to do this really quickly, so ignore the smell. Sorry. They come in. I give them a brief visualisation about what happens to the body after you die and how it decomposes, and then they fill out the same questions and they give much more right-wing answers. And it was really
enough for them to cross camps.
Yeah, well, pretty much. Yeah, absolutely. They're giving it's a big difference. It's a big difference. So the interesting thing there is we like to think that our religious our political convictions are rationally come by, that we weigh up the issues, we weigh up the but they're not. They're these gut instincts that we have to things like threat and disgust and so on, which colour everything else, and the rational mind follows afterwards.
So if you create a cultural environment that's predicated on fear and disgust, and you're not good enough, that's a considerable enticement to move in the direction of conservatism, to the point where even what is in the current rhetoric regarded as the left wing. I mean, one of the sort of challenges I have is when people go, left wing, sort of when you talk about American politics, say, left wing media conspiracy, I think they're not bloody left wing. They're supposed to, they sponsor global corporations. Yeah. They take all their funding. They're not talking about dissolution or serious taxation. There is no serious left wing, and I would say that's because the environment is sort of sustaining, and that's why that sustaining a state of borderline disgust continually, sort of topping that up. I mean, obviously that's a very beautiful example that you've given, very sort of precise and observable. But I feel like, we can't, what do I want to say, exclude what, our cultural experience, if there could ever be such a thing as a shared cultural experience. But I'm talking about mainstream media, cities and towns in the UK and across America, and the sort of our sort of shared sense of what's happening in the world now. How high is fear in the mix right now today for most people? High. How much are people worrying about the boundaries are being broken down? There's not a great deal of optimism, and that surely the bias of that is going to be, based on what you've just told me, one would imagine that the results might be sort of...
Yeah, well, that is one thing that when I look at both of those sides, although I sort of try and weigh them up and think, well, look, they're both valid, it's hard not to see, well, that side is about fear and threat, the other side is about compassion, and it's hard not to go, oh, there's a nicer side there. I mean, but it does come down again. So it's such an important point. There's the dialogue between the two, because they both keep each other in check.
Thesis, antithesis, synthesis is the way I've had that described, and evidently you have as well. I suppose, I feel like given the options, so can we not build our systems based on compassion and kindness? And the immediate fear that emerges is, but not everyone's going to do it. So who's going to guard the boundaries of our compassionate little enclaves? And men with guns comes the answer.
Yeah, it's hard, and it's always what you see. There's the fear of the outsider, the fear of the threat coming in from the outside is all about the importance of protecting the group, and that's really all it is. It just tends to show itself in horrible ways, particularly if you are predisposed at a gut level to feel compassion for weaker individuals or disenfranchised people, because they're going to suffer in that when the but it's the same again. Like, what interests me always is the internal life, really, more than that. So
yes,
it's the same thing. Do you have a dialogue with the sides of yourself that you feel threatened by, or do you try and integrate them and have that dialogue, or do you shut them out and pretend they don't exist?
Belatedly in my own life, the reason I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu now is because I recognised that I'd gone, I'm not ever going to go in that room. I'm scared of him there.
Right.
And then I sort of, hold on a minute, if you're going to become a father and you're going to individuate and incorporate that, you can't, otherwise I've just got this sort of fizzing sense of rage that's underwritten by kind of dreadful fear of impotence, and now because I'm regularly beaten to a pulp by martial arts experts, somehow that's lessening.
Has it been a useful thing?
Very much. Certainly psychologically. I would say primarily psychologically. I'm certainly no better at jiu-jitsu. No, I'm much better at jiu-jitsu than I was, but it's taught me a lot of things. One, humility, because even though I'm learning all of these things, there are still people, you're continually fighting people that are more advanced than you. That jiu-jitsu is interesting because it's sort of like wrestling and grappling, not punching in the face. You can spar it to a relatively intense level, particularly with people that are about your own ability. People that are better tend to give you a little bit of freedom and take on a role of educator.
And is it one of those martial arts where you're always working with the sort of energy the person's giving you and deflecting and moving with them rather than coming up against it?
My feeling is that most martial arts have to acknowledge those principles, but the thing that sort of mostly defines it is the sort of proximity. And for me, that was a very interesting thing, to be sort of so close to men, getting sat on, squashed, choked, armbarred, all this stuff.
Sign me up.
He's embracing his sexuality now, baby. Go on, get down here. It was it's stubble and smell, and it's sort of it's very visceral, but also very sort of loving, because the way it's sort of practiced is, you tap to submit. So there's sort of so much trust there. If you sort of go, the other person stops choking you immediately. So there's a sort of a complicity in it. I love it. It's sort of, it's earthing me and helping me to sort of embody an aspect of myself that I'd neglected. And my only relationship with my body, really, I didn't like doing sports, school, or any of that sort of stuff. My relationship with my body was my sexuality, and primarily for a quite promiscuous period of a decade or whatever, and then now I'm in a monogamous, faithful marriage, so I've got to learn what to do, with all that energy. It's got to go somewhere. It's mostly going into the arms of a Brazilian jiu-jitsu instructor. I don't mean in any fluid form, just to be clear, Derren. Just in terms of the raw kilojoules. Derren, this is, I think, certainly one of the longest. One of the most rewarding. You've certainly eaten more snacks than any other person.
I've eaten our combined body weights in grapes and cashews, but they're very nice.
When I think of some of the people we've had in here, like Yuval Noah Harari or dear Al Gore, they've never so much as been touch a grape, probably out of suspicion. They've probably got too much of that.
I had a cake made by Charlotte, your wife's friend. Yeah,
I know. Look at you. I mean, you've abundantly consumed calories. I've loved it. I also think we talked about personal stuff probably more than I can remember talking about. It felt very sort of certainly I did, and it felt like it had that kind of level. So,
but also greatly enjoyed this.
Have you?
Yeah.
Me too. I've really enjoyed it. But just checking the wonderful research done by Django. I've not asked why are you the patron of a parrot zoo, and it seems negligent not to ask that, particularly if you are the patron of a parrot zoo.
I had the
we ask this to everyone.
Patron saint. I have a little parrot. I've always had little parrots, and I got asked to. It's kind of the extent of my charitable activities.
I do parrots,
but I do. It's called what's it called now? The Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust. It's up near Skegness. And they in Boston is the sort of area, not Boston in America, Boston up there, and it's can I tell you a brief parrot story that the guy told me? So so Steve that runs it, part of his job is going out to the homes of people who have parrots, because they live for a long time, right? The big macaws, they live for 80, 90, like a long time, but they can get a bit aggressive or whatever in their later years, so often people have to get rid of them. So he ends up taking on a lot of people's parrots, so he always goes to see if there's a problem that can be solved first. So he went to this elderly couple's house, and he ends up sitting with the husband, let's call him Dave, or the wife is in the kitchen, and he says, why do you feel like you've got to get rid of this bird? Which was an African grey that was in the hallway. And Dave said, well, I love the bird a lot, but I think Doris, my wife, is starting to I think her mental health's not what it was, and if I've got to look after them both, it's going to be difficult. And while he's talking, the wife comes in with a cup of tea and gives it, there you go, Dave, and goes out. And he's like, that is the 7th cup of tea she's brought me in the last half hour. I can't be looking after them both, so I think the parrot's going to have to go. So Steve, my friend, is like, okay, well, that's, I understand that. And he wanders into the kitchen to talk to the wife. Asked her the same question, how does she feel about it? And, why does she want to get rid of the bird? And she says, well, I'd love to keep the bird, but I think Dave, my husband, is becoming a bit of a handful. And while she's talking, Dave calls out from the other room, I'll stick the kettle on, Doris. And she's like, God, that's what, the 8th cup of tea? Like he's asked for the last half an hour? I can't be looking after them both. So she makes another cup of tea. And she says, I can't look after them both. It's just going to get too difficult, so we've got to get rid of the bird. And Steve's like, right, feels really caught in the middle now of this dynamic between the two. Leaves the kitchen, walks past the bird in the hallway, and as he walks past, the bird calls out in the husband's voice, stick the kettle on, Doris. So, it's true, it's absolutely true. Not only could he tell them they could keep the parrot, but he could also tell them they didn't both have Alzheimer's, which is what they were worried about.
God, what a great visit by Steve. Yeah. Well beyond his remit as the man who runs parrot sanctuary. Oh, that's
great, isn't it? Yeah.
I'm so glad that I asked.
There you go.
Brilliant, because the parrot was the problem, but in a tangential way that could be resolved. It was doing what parrots do.
Yeah.
Tell you what, it's good that's again another testimony to your sleight of hand skills. That a story that the punchline of which is parrots mimicking human voices. I didn't see that coming.
No.
That's pretty good, isn't it?
That feels like an up ending to our conversation.
It is as well. It's like a really upbeat. Dave and Doris are going to be fine. The parrot stays. You're the patron of a parrot. Everything's going to be fine. We've got nothing to worry about.
Life is good.
Phew. Thanks, Derren.
Thank you for having me.
What a joy. Cheers, mate.
It's been lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for watching this podcast and going all the way to the end of it. Would you so kind as to click the bell? It might not be there, because over there. And subscribing so that we can infiltrate your serenity and peace of mind with jangling bells and buzzes. Thank you.